There are moments in life that divide everything into versions of yourself. The person you were before, and the person you become afterward. For me, that moment arrived on a rainy Thursday evening. Not when my mother screamed. Not when the crystal glass shattered across the dining room floor. Not even when my unborn daughter's heartbeat became the only sound I could hear. It happened when my father looked directly into my eyes and quietly chose silence. That's when I realized I had never truly belonged in that house. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 31 years old, a pediatric nurse, happily married to the kindest man I've ever known. And at the time this story begins, I was 12 weeks pregnant with my first child. If someone had asked me then whether I loved my family, I would have answered yes without hesitation. Love wasn't the problem. Hope was. I spent nearly 3 decades believing that if I worked harder, stayed quieter, forgave faster, and expected less, one day my mother would finally look at me the way she looked at my older brother. I kept waiting for a miracle that had already decided not to happen. Looking back now, the signs were everywhere. Children notice everything. We simply don't have the words for it yet. Every Saturday morning, my mother cooked pancakes. Ryan's pancakes were always perfectly round, stacked neatly with fresh strawberries and whipped cream. Mine usually came from whatever batter remained in the bowl. If there wasn't enough fruit left, she would smile without looking at me and say, "You're not picky like your brother." At 6 years old, I thought she was complimenting me. At 16, I understood she simply didn't think I deserved the effort. That realization changes a child forever. People imagine favoritism as something loud. It rarely is. Most of the time, it's built from thousands of tiny moments that no one else notices. An extra hug, a softer voice, a birthday gift that's just a little more expensive, an excuse made for one child, and impossible standards for the other. Those little moments pile on top of each other until one child grows up believing they're extraordinary, while the other grows up apologizing for existing. Ryan was my mother's masterpiece. He could do no wrong. If he forgot Mother's Day, he was busy. If I missed a phone call, I was ungrateful. When he lost his job, she paid his rent for 8 months. When I graduated nursing school with honors, she asked whether hospitals still hired average-looking girls. I laughed. Everyone else laughed. Because that's what families do when cruelty wears the mask of humor. My father never joined in. He simply stayed quiet. At the time, I mistook silence for kindness. Now I know silence can be another form of permission. Dad wasn't cruel. He was exhausted. He spent 35 years convincing himself that keeping the peace was the same thing as protecting his family. It wasn't. Peace built on fear isn't peace. It's surrender. I learned that lesson much later. By then, the damage had already become tradition. The funny thing about leaving home is that distance has a way of revealing truth you couldn't see from the inside. When I moved 3 hours away for nursing school, I discovered something remarkable. Nobody there knew who my mother was. Nobody compared me to Ryan. Nobody cared whether I looked perfect. Patients didn't need perfection. They needed someone who noticed when a frightened child tried to smile through pain. They needed steady hands, gentle words, patience. For the first time in my life, I wasn't competing for love. I was simply useful. And somehow that felt even better. That's where I met Daniel. He wasn't dramatic. He wasn't flashy. He was the kind of man who remembered the names of janitors and thanked waitresses twice. The first conversation we ever had lasted almost 3 hours because his car wouldn't start outside the hospital. He apologized 6 different times for wasting my evening. I married him because I realized I'd never once apologized for being myself around him. That feeling is rarer than people think. Our wedding was small, simple, beautiful. My mother arrived wearing a cream-colored dress, suspiciously close to white. Half the guests noticed. Nobody said anything. Again, silence. During the reception, she pulled Daniel aside and smiled sweetly enough that photographers kept taking pictures. Later, he told me what she'd whispered. "Claire has always been sensitive. Don't let her emotions make your decisions." He squeezed my hand while he repeated it. Then he smiled. "Good thing I make my own decisions." That was the day I knew I'd married the right man. For 2 years, life became wonderfully ordinary. Morning coffee, late-night grocery runs, movie nights on old blankets, arguments over whose turn it was to fold laundry. The beautiful little routines people don't appreciate until they're threatened. Then, one February morning, I stared at 2 pink lines on a pregnancy test. My hands trembled so hard I almost dropped it. Daniel cried before I did. He laughed through tears, wrapped both arms around me, and whispered, "We're going to meet our little girl someday." We didn't know the baby's gender. He just somehow believed. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine something dangerous. Maybe a grandchild would heal everything. Maybe my mother would finally see me instead of comparing me. Maybe this tiny heartbeat would build a bridge across 30 years of disappointment. Hope is incredibly persuasive. Sometimes it's also incredibly blind. 3 weeks later, we scheduled a family dinner. I practiced the announcement in the car 3 separate times. Daniel kept smiling. You don't have to rehearse, he said. I know. So why are you? I looked out the window. Because I've spent my whole life trying to say the right thing. He reached across the console and intertwined his fingers with mine. There isn't a perfect sentence, he whispered. There are only people willing to hear it. I wish I'd understood those words sooner. Because as we turned onto my parents' street that evening, every instinct I'd spent decades developing suddenly came alive. The curtains were already open. Every light in the house was blazing. The front door stood half open, and before we'd even parked the car, I could hear shouting from inside. I looked at Daniel. He looked back at me. Neither of us knew it yet, but before that night ended, our family would never sit around the same dinner table again. There is a strange silence that exists only inside families. It isn't peaceful. It isn't comfortable. It's the silence built from years of people pretending not to notice what everyone already knows. That was the silence waiting for us when Daniel and I stepped through my parents' front door. The smell of roasted chicken drifted from the kitchen. Soft jazz played through hidden speakers. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath the dining room lights. From the outside, everything looked perfect. My mother had always believed appearances could erase reality. She greeted us with her usual flawless smile. There you are, she said warmly, kissing Daniel's cheek before barely acknowledging mine. Dinner's almost ready. To anyone watching, she looked like the picture of a loving mother. But I noticed the tiny details. The stiffness in her shoulders. The way she kept checking the hallway. The tension hidden beneath her polished voice. Years of surviving that house had taught me something nursing school never could. People speak long before they open their mouths. Ryan arrived a few minutes later with his wife, Melissa. They had been married for almost 5 years. Everyone in the family knew they had been trying for a baby. Everyone also knew it hadn't been easy. It was one of the few subjects my mother treated like a public project. She constantly reminded everyone that the Bennett family needed an heir, not a grandchild, an heir, as if our family name were attached to a kingdom instead of a small accounting business. Melissa looked exhausted. She smiled politely, but the smile never reached her eyes. I hugged her a little longer than usual. She whispered, almost too quietly to hear, I've had a rough week. I squeezed her hand. You don't have to pretend tonight, she nodded, but neither of us believed that was possible in this house. Pretending was the family tradition. Dinner began exactly on schedule. Dad carved the chicken. My mother complimented everyone's posture. Ryan talked about work. Daniel politely asked questions. For nearly 30 minutes, everything felt rehearsed. Like actors following a script they'd performed hundreds of times. Then my mother lifted her wine glass. I've been thinking, she announced with theatrical enthusiasm. Next Christmas, I hope this house is full of baby toys. Ryan shifted uncomfortably. Melissa lowered her eyes. I know it's only a matter of time, Mother continued. Good things happen to people who don't give up. The words sounded encouraging. The pressure behind them was crushing. Melissa quietly excused herself to the restroom. No one stopped her. No one needed to. We all knew she was crying. Daniel looked at me beneath the table. His expression asked the question neither of us wanted to answer. Now? I hesitated. Every instinct told me to wait. But we'd already postponed this announcement for weeks. There would never be a perfect moment. I slowly reached into my purse and pulled out the tiny envelope holding our baby's ultrasound. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear myself breathe. Mom, every conversation stopped. I actually have some news. Dad looked up first. Ryan smiled. Even Melissa returned from the hallway just in time to hear my next sentence. I'm pregnant. For one breathtaking second, time stood perfectly still. Then Daniel laughed through tears and wrapped his arm around me. We're having a baby. Dad's carving knife slipped onto his plate with a metallic clang. His eyes filled instantly. My little girl. It was the first time I'd heard him call me that in years. Ryan stood up and hugged us. Melissa followed, crying openly now. I'm so happy for you, she whispered. And somehow, her joy made me cry even harder. She was grieving her own dream, yet celebrating mine. That is what love looks like. Then I turned toward my mother. She hadn't moved. Not even an inch. Her smile had disappeared completely. Her face looked strangely empty, as though every emotion inside her had frozen solid. Finally, she spoke. When? 12 weeks, I answered softly. We waited until everything looked healthy. She nodded once, very slowly. 12 weeks. Another pause. Then she looked directly at Ryan. So? Her voice became dangerously calm. You couldn't be first. The room instantly changed. Ryan frowned. What? Mother stood up. Her chair scraped sharply across the hardwood floor. The first Bennett grandchild, she looked back at me, was supposed to belong to your brother. Nobody spoke. Not because we agreed. Because we couldn't believe what we just heard. Daniel's arm tightened protectively around my shoulder. Claire didn't plan this to hurt anyone, he said carefully. Mother ignored him completely. I've invested years helping Ryan and Melissa. Her breathing became faster. I've prayed, I've sacrificed, I've waited, and now this? She pointed directly at my stomach. This wasn't supposed to happen first. The room fell into absolute silence. Even the music seemed too loud. I stared at her. Waiting. Hoping. Begging with every part of myself for her to laugh, to apologize, to admit she'd spoken without thinking. Instead, she took one slow step toward me, then another. And another. Daniel immediately stood. So did Ryan. Dad remained frozen beside the table. Nobody knew exactly what was happening. Except me. Because I'd seen that look in my mother's eyes once before. Years earlier. Right before she'd smashed every photograph of my college graduation. Because I chose nursing instead of joining the family business. I recognized the storm. I just never imagined that this time I was carrying someone else inside me, and suddenly, I wasn't afraid for myself anymore. I was terrified for my child. Fear has a strange way of slowing time. People say everything happens in a blur, during a traumatic moment. For me, it happened frame by frame. My mother's polished heels clicked softly against the hardwood floor as she walked toward me. One step, then another. No one moved. Not because they didn't care, because no one in that dining room believed she would actually cross the line. Families like ours survive by believing tomorrow will somehow be different from yesterday. We mistake denial for hope. Daniel instinctively stepped in front of me. Claire's pregnant, he said quietly, his voice calm despite the panic in his eyes. Let's all take a breath. My mother didn't even acknowledge him. Her eyes never left mine. You knew exactly what you were doing. I blinked in confusion. What? You stole this moment? Her voice cracked. Not with sadness, with rage. You knew your brother and Melissa have been trying for years. I didn't even know they were having another treatment, I whispered. That doesn't matter. Her words exploded through the room. The first grandchild should have been theirs. Ryan immediately stood. Mom, stop. She ignored him. Melissa grabbed Ryan's arm, shaking her head, silently begging him not to make things worse. My father finally spoke. Susan, just one word. Soft, almost apologetic. It wasn't enough. It had never been enough. For 30 years, my father had tried to calm storms instead of stopping them. Storms don't negotiate. They destroy. My mother was only 3 feet away now. Daniel extended one arm protectively across my body. That's close enough. She laughed. A cold, humorless laugh. You think you know my daughter? No, Daniel answered. I know my wife. The room became perfectly still for a brief second. I thought his words had reached her. Then she looked directly at my stomach. If that baby had any respect for this family, I stared at her. It would have waited. The sentence stole the air from the room. Melissa covered her mouth. Ryan whispered, Oh my God, I felt something inside me break. Not loudly, quietly, like a thread stretched for decades, finally giving way. I looked at the woman who had raised me and realized she wasn't looking at her daughter. She was looking at an obstacle. Something standing between her dream and reality. I've spent my whole life trying to earn your love, I said softly. My voice surprised even me. There was no anger in it anymore. Only exhaustion. I was 6. When I stopped asking why Ryan always got more. I was 12. When I realized you remembered his favorite birthday cake but forgot mine. I was 22 when you introduced me at church as Ryan's sister. A tear slipped down my cheek. And tonight, I rested my hand over my stomach. I'm done competing. For one impossible moment, I thought I saw regret. Then her face hardened again. You always were dramatic. Those 4 words hurt more than every insult before them. Because they erased everything. Every birthday. Every achievement. Every lonely child who had spent years believing she simply wasn't enough. Daniel squeezed my hand. We're leaving. He reached for our coats. We almost made it to the hallway. Almost. Behind us came the sound of porcelain shattering. A serving plate crashed against the wall, exploding into dozens of white pieces. Everyone turned. My mother stood beside the dining table, breathing heavily. Her face was almost unrecognizable. "This family is falling apart because of you." "No," Ryan shouted for the first time in his life. "It's falling apart because of you." The silence afterward was deafening. My brother had never challenged her. Not once. She looked at him as though she'd been betrayed. "I've done everything for you." Ryan slowly shook his head. "You did everything to control us." Her shoulders trembled. "You ungrateful." She took another step. This time, toward Ryan. Without thinking, I instinctively moved between them. It was the habit of a lifetime. Protect everyone else. Forget yourself. The next second happened too fast. My mother shoved me aside. Hard. I lost my balance. Daniel caught me before I could fall, wrapping both arms around me. "Claire." "I'm okay, at least I thought I was," until I felt a warm sensation running down my leg. I looked down. A single drop of blood landed on the polished hardwood floor. Then another. The room froze. Nobody spoke. Nobody breathed. Daniel looked down. His face lost all color. "We're going to the hospital now." Ryan grabbed his keys. Melissa was already dialing emergency services. For the first time that evening, my mother looked frightened. Not because of what she'd done, because everyone had seen it. She opened her mouth. No words came out. Then, the front doorbell rang. Once. Twice. 3 calm, patient chimes. Everyone turned toward the entrance. Whoever stood outside had no idea they were about to walk into the worst night of our family's history. My father slowly opened the front door. Standing on the porch was an elegant woman in her early 60s. Silver hair, dark blue coat, small leather suitcase resting beside her feet. She smiled politely. Then her eyes found me. Her expression changed instantly. She stepped inside without waiting for permission. Her gaze moved across the shattered dishes, the blood on the floor, my terrified husband, my shaking mother. Finally, she looked directly at Susan. Her voice was quiet, almost gentle. "You haven't changed." My mother's face turned completely white. The woman took one more step into the house, then she looked at me, really looked at me, as tears filled her eyes. "My goodness," she whispered. "You have my face." Every person in that room looked back and forth between us. The same green eyes, the same jawline, the same smile. It was like looking 30 years into my future. My father closed his eyes, as though the secret he'd carried for decades had finally decided it was tired of hiding. He swallowed hard. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke the words that would change my life forever. "Claire." He looked at the stranger. "This is your Aunt Eleanor." Some truths don't explode. They simply arrive, quietly, and once they're spoken, nothing in your life can ever return to what it was before. The ambulance lights painted my parents' driveway in flashes of red and blue. Daniel refused to let go of my hand. Every few seconds, he looked at me, then at the tiny streak of blood on my dress, as though staring hard enough could somehow make it disappear. "I'm here," he whispered. "I know. You and our baby, you're coming home." I nodded. Not because I believed him, because I needed him to. 2 hours later, the emergency room was painfully familiar. Usually, I was the nurse calming frightened families. Tonight, I was the frightened family. The ultrasound technician smiled before she even spoke. "There's your little one." A tiny heartbeat filled the room. Fast, strong, perfect. I closed my eyes. For the first time since dinner, I breathed. The bleeding had stopped. The doctor explained it was only a small bruise. Our daughter was safe. Daniel broke down crying beside the bed. He kissed my forehead again and again. "I almost lost both of you." "You didn't." "No," he smiled through tears. "I almost let someone else take you away." The visitor the next morning. A soft knock came at the hospital door. I expected my father. Instead, Aunt Eleanor walked inside carrying 2 cups of coffee. She sat quietly beside my bed. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, she smiled. "You laugh exactly like my mother." I looked at her. "And apparently, I look exactly like you." She laughed softly. "You certainly do." She reached into her handbag and removed an old photograph. It showed 2 teenage girls standing outside a county fair. One was unmistakably my mother. The other looked exactly like me. I was 20, Eleanor said. Your mother was 17. I couldn't stop staring. You weren't imagining things your whole childhood. What do you mean? She folded her hands together. Your mother wasn't jealous because you weren't beautiful enough. A pause. She was jealous because every time she looked at you, she saw me. I frowned. I don't understand. Eleanor took a deep breath. Our mother compared us every single day. She told your mother she was pretty, and told me I was unforgettable. I blinked. What? Beauty fades, she smiled sadly. But kindness doesn't. Our mother hated that people remembered me instead of my appearance. When I left home, your mother finally became the only daughter. For years, she believed she'd finally won. Another silence. Then you were born. I looked down. So every time she saw me, she remembered losing. Eleanor nodded. None of this was ever your fault. Those words, 31 years late, changed something inside me forever. My father's choice that afternoon, Dad arrived carrying flowers. Not expensive ones, just simple daisies. Mom's least favorite. My favorite. He sat beside my bed. I filed for divorce. I stared at him. What I should have protected you. His voice cracked. I kept convincing myself keeping the peace was love. It wasn't. It was cowardice. He looked toward the sleeping ultrasound picture lying beside me. I won't make that mistake with my granddaughter. For the first time in my life, my father chose us. Not with promises, with actions. 3 months later, winter arrived. The leaves disappeared. Court hearings ended. The protection order became permanent. My mother never apologized. Not really. She sent flowers, expensive gifts, Christmas cards signed only with her name. Never once did she admit what she'd done. Some people would call that pride. I call it fear. Because admitting the truth would have meant admitting she'd become the very person who hurt her. And she wasn't ready. Maybe she never would be. 7 months later, at exactly 3:18, on a snowy November morning, our daughter entered the world. 7 pounds, 4 ounces. The loudest cry I'd ever heard. Daniel held her first, then placed her gently into my arms. She wrapped one tiny hand around my finger, and in that instant, every version of my childhood appeared. Not because it stopped hurting, because it stopped defining me. My father cried harder than anyone in the room. Ryan and Melissa stood beside him. 2 months earlier, they'd discovered they were expecting a baby too. Not because anyone pressured them, because life finally arrived on its own schedule. Ryan hugged me tightly. I'm sorry. For what? For never seeing what was happening. You were surviving too, he nodded. We all were. 1 year later, people still ask about my mother. They expect a dramatic ending, a tearful reunion, a miraculous apology. Life rarely works that way. She still owns her boutique, still smiles for photographs, still tells people family means everything. Maybe, to her, it does. But I finally learned something important. Family isn't the people who demand your loyalty. Family is the people who protect your peace. Sometimes they're related to you, sometimes they're chosen. And sometimes, they're the tiny little girl now running across my living room laughing so hard she can't catch her breath. Every Sunday morning we make pancakes together. Some are perfectly round, some fall apart. Some burn. We laugh anyway. Because in this house, no child earns love by being perfect. No child competes for affection. No child wonders whether they're enough. One afternoon, my daughter opened the kitchen drawer and found an old measuring tape left behind after we moved. She looked at it curiously. Daddy, what's this for? Daniel smiled. Measuring furniture. She nodded, satisfied, and ran back outside to play. I watched her leave, then quietly picked up that tape measure, walked to the trash can, and threw it away. Some things don't belong in a family. Not anymore. Not ever. As I watched my daughter chasing butterflies beneath the afternoon sun, I finally understood something my younger self had spent years searching for. Healing isn't forgetting. Healing is refusing to pass the pain to someone who never deserved it. The cycle that shaped generations ended with me. And the little girl laughing in our backyard will never know the weight of earning love. She'll only know what love was always meant to be. Freely given. Freely received. No conditions. No comparisons. No price. Only family.